What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. This video is oriented towards the beginner anglers, those who want to get started in bass fishing. If you are new to the sport, I would suggest paying attention because a lot of these tips that I'm about to give you, you might find very helpful. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to go over these illustrations that I have right here to show you how you can catch more fish with the baits that you see laid out in front of you. Each bait corresponds particularly to the location that you see on the drawing, and each drawing has information and locations where you are most likely to find fish. So let's start off with the first one down the bottom, which is obviously a river, preferably a rocky river. If you can find a rocky river, that is the best place because rivers that don't have rocks oftentimes are slow and stagnant, and bass normally are kind of gumbos and don't really like to eat that often and are really unhealthy and just don't put up a good fight. So it's not much fun fishing those kinds of rivers. But if you can find rivers with rocks, you can find A, smallmouth, which are the best fish species in the world to catch, and B, a lot of fish looking for a quick, easy meal because these fish in rocky rivers, I find at least, are normally always hungry. So the first place that you should hopefully look for when you're looking for a rocky river would be like a deep hole like this. You can find fish suspending in these deep holes, feeding on shad, maybe bluegills, maybe minnows, maybe crawfish. You never know what kind of a meal a bass would be looking for in those shallow holes, or in those deep holes, I'm sorry. Next place would be a little cove like this, where you find slow moving water. Oftentimes the bass will wait in those spots to wait for something to get swept into the current and wait and pause and take a break in these little coves. That's when these bass like to go on the move, and it's also a good spot for the bass themselves to take a break. Next spot is where you're probably going to find the most hungry bass, which would be on the tips of points, because the bass will hang out on these points waiting for food to flow down into them, and that is when they attack their food. Oftentimes when you catch fish there, the fish are going to have the most fight too, because those fish spend most of their time hanging out in the current. And then the last spot that you're going to find in these rivers would be a rocky flat or a rocky bank, just a straightforward rocky bank. A lot of crawfish can be found in these locations, a lot of gobies can be found in these locations, and a lot of smallmouth and largemouth can be found in these locations as well. And similar to the point fish, these fish spend most of their days in current, so they will put up a good fight. Now, as for the baits, you got your basics. You got a tube, a jig, preferably a football jig. These jigs are best for rocks. A Senko, a relatively realistic craw, and then a spinnerbait. I wouldn't really expand much further than this. You can throw crankbaits and jerkbaits and get bit, but preferably if you fish these is how this is how you're gonna get your most bites without a doubt. Fish tubes on a tube jig head. Fish these with craw trailers and just fish it slowly around rocks. Fish these wacky rig preferably. Fish these Texas rigged, and then slow roll spinnerbait. Alright, so that is it for the river. Now moving on to lakes. So, when you're fishing lakes, one thing you want to look for are boat docks, points, pockets in the middle of the lake with weeds, creeks flowing in, and then rocky flats. The first place that I would go would be docks like this, because you can find bass hidden underneath those docks waiting for a bait fish or something to swim up in there. When the bass sees it, they'll just take it real quick without hesitation. The point bass that you find out on points are really hard fighting and oftentimes really big. The bass out in the middle are relatively hard to catch just because there's so much water that you can fish. So I would preferably, if you can, try and stay away from those middle bass just because it might take you a while to establish a pattern. Out in these rocky points, again, you're going to find smallmouth. I just voice cracked really hard there. My apologies. You're going to find smallmouth. And in these cuts right here, you oftentimes find plant life, vegetation, sometimes lily pads. And then you're going to find the bass suspended underneath those lily pads. Be a good place to check a frog. Maybe a spinnerbait, slow roll spinnerbait. Although spinnerbait isn't on the list for these lures that I would fish around a lake. So, I think that's that you guys get the gist about lakes. One other thing I forgot to mention is when you're fishing these rocky flats, again, go with a craw pattern or a bait fish pattern. And let's get this illustration out of the way. So the baits that I would fish, first off, my number one go-to would be a square bill. I like fishing square bills around laydowns and docks. If you can cast a square bill parallel to a dock, it's a guaranteed bite. Another thing that is really good around docks and laydowns would be some kind of beaver bait. This is a Strike King baby rodent. If you haven't noticed a pattern already, I like fishing docks a lot, and I think you guys would like fishing docks too. If you can get out early in the morning, like before everyone else is out there, and find those points, casting around a topwater bait, specifically a whopper plopper, seems to be a awesome way to catch them. For those middle of the lake bass and Rocky Point bass, I would throw jerkbait, just because these seem to be more reaction strike baits, and you can cover a lot more water with these baits. I find that when I'm fishing a crankbait, I like to make short little casts and fish it pretty fast. And then for those weed patches by the creek mouse, obviously you can't go wrong with a frog. One other thing for those beginner bass anglers, if you're going to get a frog, get one with a black belly. Don't be afraid to take these things out of the packages and look on the bottom, because when you're going to buy this thing, all you're going to see is the top. When I bought this thing, I saw yellow spots, but I saw that the rest of the body was black, so I knew that the bottom was going to be black. So there you go, guys. There's my lake baits, top 5 lake baits. If you haven't already, I'll be sure to check out these baits after this video. Make sure to maybe order some, go buy some, because I guarantee you every single one of these baits will catch you a fish. Although the whopper ploppers are pretty expensive, so if you're a beginner, maybe I would just go with the Rebel popper. But anyway, and then the last spot you all know is a pond. So the first place that I'll go to a pond again is a dock. I love fishing docks. I love pitching Senkos in ponds by docks, and I like casting chatterbaits parallel with the docks, and sometimes swim jigs are pretty good too. One other thing you're going to find a lot in ponds are lily pads. So again, a frog is pretty killer. Out in the center of the pond, you might find tall weeds like milfoil and caddis and other plant life like that. If you have it, a spinnerbait is really good to chuck and wind through this. Another good place for a spinnerbait would be just on a straight open bank like this. These little fish right here are bluegills. I seem to always find that bass are feeding on more bluegill patterns when I'm fishing a pond. That's just because ponds have a lot of bluegills. So you got your bass suspending around these bluegills, waiting for an ambush. Laydowns, there's always going to be a bass around a laydown. Don't be afraid to cast into the thick stuff. Maybe you'll lose a bait, but that's just part of the sport. And then you got bushes and like thorns and other kinds of plants like hidden along the shoreline, and sometimes those plants will grow and grow over the shoreline, and you'll find bass hiding underneath those shorelines. So, excuse me. First bait that I would bring when I'm fishing pond would be a frog. You can get out there early in the morning and find those weed patches. Frogs are very killer. I would, in this instance, if I'm fishing a pond, I would go for a more natural frog color, just because in an open lake, where I showed you that frog, in an open lake, bass aren't really looking to bite a frog. They're just kind of looking to hit something that's on the top of the surface. So black is just kind of there. It just kind of makes a disturbance. If you get a frog pattern, the bass are going to see a frog, and frogs like ponds. Next up, you know what? Senko, wacky rig it, cast it out, twitch it back, do nothing special with it. It'll get bit. Next up, you got swim jig, bluegill imitator. This isn't a bluegill color. As for the trailer, I would throw on a swim bait, a curly tail grub, or like a rage tail menace grub. Buzzbait, I like throwing these things early in the morning along with frogs too. One thing that I find to be pretty effective is if I miss a frog bite, I will throw in a buzzbait, and sometimes that will get them. And then, y'all know, Dirty Dozen, we got spinnerbait, good all-around bluegill imitation. Honestly, you can throw a spinnerbait in any of these situations, whether it be lake, rivers, and ponds, and get bit. But if I had a choice, I would fish a spinnerbait at a pond. Alright, so there you go, guys. There is all of my hand-drawn illustrations to help the beginners and maybe remind the experienced about how they can catch bass and what to throw. If you don't have any of these baits, I would strongly recommend getting some. As always, guys, leave a like, hit the subscribe button, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.